The Fatal Miscalculation: How Japan Misread America and Lost an Empire. In the spring of 1940, aboard the flagship Nagato, a solitary Japanese naval officer contemplated a plan that would seal his nation's destiny. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was designing the most audacious surprise attack in modern naval warfare, yet he alone understood why it was doomed to fail. The paradox was striking. The architect of Pearl Harbor was also the only Japanese leader who truly comprehended American resolve. The man who knew too much. Yamamoto's understanding came from experience, not theory. Between 1919 and 1921, he studied at Harvard University, officially enrolled as a special English student, but dedicating himself to understanding the petroleum industry that powered American might. During summer breaks, he hitchhiked across the country, visiting Texas oil fields to witness American industrial capacity firsthand. His classmates remembered him as exceptionally curious and hardworking. When they introduced him to poker, he became obsessed, staying awake entire nights to master the game. He studied probability mathematics, bluffing psychology, and the art of reading opponents. Those late-night poker sessions taught him something crucial about Americans that his fellow officers never grasped. Americans weren't reckless, they were calculating. They played for the long term, accepting short-term losses to establish winning positions. And when they held winning hands, they pressed their advantage without mercy. Later, as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, Yamamoto traveled extensively. He toured automobile factories in Detroit, watching assembly lines produce cars at seemingly impossible rates. He visited steel mills in Pittsburgh and oil refineries in Texas, calculating tonnages and production rates that terrified him. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America, he later observed. He continued playing poker with American naval officers, winning consistently and developing what he termed contempt for their card-playing skills. But crucially, he never confused skill at cards with national character, the prophecy ignored. When Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe asked about war prospects with the United States, Yamamoto delivered a chilling prediction. If ordered to fight, he could run wild for the first 6 months and win victory after victory. Beyond that, he foresaw only defeat. 6 months. That was all Japan had. The Battle of Midway, which shattered Japanese naval power and reversed the Pacific War's momentum, occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had predicted his own failure with terrifying precision. Yet Japan attacked anyway. The seductive precedent, the roots of Japan's fatal miscalculation stretched back decades to a victory that seemed to prove their strategy worked. In 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, a striking parallel to Pearl Harbor. Without formal declaration of war, they delivered a devastating blow against an enemy fleet at anchor, destroying naval power before Russia could mobilize. And it succeeded. Over the following year, Japan defeated Russia repeatedly. On land, they captured Port Arthur after a grueling siege and won at Mukden in the longest battle of modern history to that point. The climax came at Tsushima in May 1905, when Admiral Togo Heihiro annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet. The Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron had sailed 7 months and 18,000 nautical miles from the Baltic Sea, arriving exhausted, poorly supplied, and demoralized. Togo positioned his fleet to cross the T of the Russian formation, a classic maneuver allowing all Japanese guns to bear, while only leading Russian ships could respond. The result was annihilation. Russia lost 11 battleships, 7 sunk, 4 captured, plus numerous smaller vessels and over 5,000 men. Japan lost 3 torpedo boats and 117 sailors. It was the most decisive naval victory since Trafalgar. More significantly, it marked the first time in modern history that a non-Western nation had defeated a major European power. Japanese military planners drew a lesson that would haunt them. A surprise attack followed by rapid military success could force a larger power to negotiate rather than fight prolonged war. The lesson was catastrophically wrong. Russia had been weakened by internal revolution, stretched across 2 continents, fighting 12,000 miles from its industrial heartland. Japan's victory owed as much to Russian weakness as Japanese strength, but the Japanese remembered only triumph. Tsushima became their template for defeating superior enemies. Strike first, strike hard, and the enemy will negotiate. They would try the same strategy against America. It would not work. The contempt that blinded. Japan's miscalculation grew from something deeper than flawed strategic analysis. It grew from contempt. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese military leaders watched Western democracies with disdain. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Germany remilitarized the Rhineland and absorbed Austria. Japan itself invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched full-scale war against China in 1937. The Western powers protested, condemned, imposed ineffective sanctions, but didn't fight.
Japanese leaders concluded that democracies lacked stomach for war. Nations valuing individual rights and personal comfort couldn't match Japan's sacrificial spirit, where duty to the emperor transcended all personal concerns. This contempt was reinforced by racial thinking pervading Japanese military culture. Many officers believed Americans were fundamentally inferior warriors, too attached to luxury and comfort to endure prolonged conflict's hardships. They pointed to isolationist politics, divided public opinion about foreign wars, and apparent reluctance to fight as evidence of national weakness. One 1941 Japanese military assessment concluded that Americans loved luxury, their culture was shallow and meaningless, and they lacked spiritual strength for sustained warfare. It was a catastrophic misreading of American character. Yamamoto, who had actually lived among Americans, tried correcting this delusion. He warned that most people thought Americans loved luxury and were weak, but this was mistaken. Americans would respond to attack with determination and fury. Nobody listened. The industrial delusion. Japanese leaders made one more fatal calculation. Even if America fought back, its industrial capacity would take years to mobilize. Japan would have time to consolidate conquests, establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, and force America to accept negotiated settlement rather than fight a long war reclaiming distant islands. This too was wrong. Japanese military planners understood in abstract that America possessed enormous industrial potential. Internal Imperial Navy studies from 1941 showed exactly the trends in American shipbuilding that would eventually overwhelm them. They understood the numbers, but they convinced themselves that democracy made this potential irrelevant. They believed American workers wouldn't accept wartime production sacrifices, that labor disputes would paralyze factories, that a divided Congress would obstruct mobilization, and that the public would demand peace rather than endure years of rationing and casualties. They were gambling that Americans would choose comfort over victory. In 1939, American military aircraft production was under 3,000 aircraft annually. Hitler was told that President Roosevelt's calls for 50,000 aircraft yearly were impossible propaganda. By 1944, American factories were producing nearly 100,000 aircraft per year, more in 1944 alone than Japan produced during the entire war. The stranglehold. On July 26, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed within days. The immediate trigger was Japan's occupation of French Indochina, but the effect was devastating. The asset freeze didn't merely restrict trade, it effectively ended all commercial relations. Japanese bank accounts froze. Japanese ships in American ports couldn't load cargo. Contracts were voided. Trade that had flowed for decades stopped overnight. The combined effect was catastrophic. Japan lost access to 3/4 of its overseas trade and 88% of its imported oil. Japan imported most oil from the United States. Without American oil, reserves could sustain normal operations perhaps 3 years. Under wartime conditions, that estimate dropped to 18 months or less. Japanese military planners confronted a terrible choice: accept American demands to withdraw from China and abandon imperial ambitions, or go to war to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and Southeast Asia's resources.
For militarists dominating the government, withdrawal from China was unthinkable. It would mean admitting 4 years of war and hundreds of thousands of casualties had been wasted. It would mean political humiliation and probably government collapse. They chose war instead. The warning in the letter. Yamamoto understood what victory against America truly demanded. In a letter meant to warn against war, he wrote that it wouldn't be enough to take Guam, the Philippines, or even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, Japan would have to march into Washington and dictate peace terms in the White House. He wondered aloud whether politicians had confidence in the final outcome. His words were meant as stark warning about victory's impossibility. Japanese militarists later truncated the quote to make it sound like a boast. He wasn't being rhetorical, he was stating strategic truth. America wasn't Russia. It couldn't be knocked out by naval defeats in distant waters. Its industrial heartland was protected by 2 oceans. Its population was enormous, its resources virtually unlimited. Yamamoto knew this because he'd seen it firsthand. Yet he also understood that his country had made its choice. His warning to Prime Minister Konoe had gone unheeded. Japan would fight, and Yamamoto would do his duty, knowing all the while that time was against them. He designed Pearl Harbor not to win the war, but to buy time. If Japan could destroy the American Pacific Fleet and establish a defensive perimeter before American industrial power mobilized, perhaps, America would choose to negotiate rather than fight a long war reclaiming distant Pacific islands. It was a desperate gamble. Yamamoto knew it, but his superiors refused to listen. December 7th. Tactical victory, strategic disaster. At 7:55 on the morning of December 7, 1941, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the attack force. As his aircraft approached Oahu, he saw no American fighters rising to intercept, no anti-aircraft fire, no sign Americans expected an attack. He transmitted the code phrase, "Tora, Tora, Tora," signaling complete surprise had been achieved. Over the next 2 hours, 353 aircraft from 6 Japanese carriers attacked the Pacific Fleet at anchor. Torpedo planes skimmed low to drop weapons against battleships moored along Ford Island. Dive bombers screamed down to plant bombs on decks and hangars. Horizontal bombers released loads from high altitude. Fighters strafed anything that moved.
The devastation was severe. The battleship Arizona was struck by multiple bombs in the opening minutes. One armor-piercing bomb, a modified 16-inch naval shell, penetrated the deck near turret 2 and detonated in the forward magazine where over 1 million pounds of gunpowder was stored. The explosion was catastrophic. A fireball erupted that was visible for miles. The forward section was completely destroyed. The vessel settled to the harbor bottom in less than 9 minutes. 1,177 of her crew were killed, nearly half of all American deaths that day. The Oklahoma capsized after multiple torpedoes hit her port side. She rolled over completely, trapping hundreds of sailors below decks. Rescue workers could hear men tapping on the hull for days afterward, but most couldn't be reached in time. 429 men died aboard Oklahoma. By the time the last Japanese aircraft withdrew shortly after 9:30, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Nearly 20 ships had been sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft had been destroyed, most on the ground before they could resist. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers in triumph. They'd achieved complete surprise, inflicted massive casualties with minimal losses, only 29 aircraft and 5 submarines. The operation had succeeded beyond all expectations. But they'd made critical errors. The American aircraft carriers, the most important vessels in the fleet, weren't in port that day. Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego undergoing repairs. The Japanese had sunk battleships, relics of an earlier naval warfare era, but the carriers that would win the Pacific War escaped untouched. The attackers also failed to destroy critical infrastructure. Fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor held 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough to keep the Pacific Fleet operating for months. A determined attack on these tanks would have crippled American operations far more effectively than sinking battleships. The dry docks and repair facilities were also largely intact. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, chose not to launch a third strike. His pilots had accomplished their primary mission. The element of surprise was gone. American defenders were now alert and fighting back fiercely. Nagumo worried about the American carrier's location and didn't want to risk his precious fleet carriers to potential counterattack. He withdrew, leaving behind a devastated harbor, but also an untouched industrial base, intact fuel supplies, and the carriers that would soon strike back. And there was something else the Japanese hadn't destroyed, something that would prove far more important than any ship: American resolve. The awakening. The Japanese attack was intended to shatter American morale and convince the public that war with Japan would be too costly. It achieved the exact opposite. Before December 7th, American public opinion was deeply divided. While most sympathized with the Allies, they had no desire to send their sons to fight foreign conflicts. Isolationist sentiment was powerful. The attack unified the nation overnight. Within 24 hours of President Roosevelt's address declaring December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, the Senate voted unanimously for war, 82-0. The House followed with 388-1, with only pacifist Jeanette Rankin of Montana dissenting. The America First Committee, the most powerful isolationist organization, dissolved itself within days. Before Pearl Harbor, Americans debated whether the war was their concern. After Pearl Harbor, 16 million Americans served in uniform. Japanese planners expected the shock would discourage resistance. Instead, it created fury that wouldn't be satisfied until Japan surrendered unconditionally. Remember Pearl Harbor became the rallying cry of a nation. The sneak attack delivered before formal declaration convinced Americans that Japan wasn't merely an enemy, but a treacherous one that had to be thoroughly defeated. The Japanese had awakened exactly what Yamamoto feared. They'd united a divided nation and filled it with terrible resolve. The first counterpunch. The first evidence that Japan had miscalculated came just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, from the least expected direction. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers lifted off from the aircraft carrier Hornet, 650 miles from the Japanese coast. It was the first time medium bombers had ever launched from a carrier, and pilots had no expectation of returning to the ship. Their plan was to bomb Japan and fly onto airfields in China. Lieutenant James Don Ludefaux led the raid. At 45, he was a former racing pilot and aviation pioneer who had set speed records and earned a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT. When asked to plan a strike on Japan, he volunteered to lead it personally. The mission nearly failed before it began. Early on April 18th, a Japanese patrol boat spotted the American task force and radioed a contact report before being sunk. Admiral William Halsey faced a difficult decision. The original plan called for launching bombers at dusk, 400 miles from Japan, but with Japanese forces now alert, every hour of delay increased risk. Halsey ordered immediate launch, 200 miles farther from Japan than planned, in bright daylight.
Doolittle's B-25 was first off the deck at 8:20 a.m. The other 15 aircraft followed over the next hour, each crew knowing the early launch meant they wouldn't have enough fuel to reach planned landing sites in China. They would have to ditch in the ocean, bail out over Japanese-occupied territory, or hope to reach Chinese lines before tanks ran dry. All 16 aircraft reached Japan and struck their targets. Doolittle himself bombed an aircraft factory in Tokyo. Other crews hit steel mills, oil tank farms, and military installations. Anti-aircraft fire was scattered. Japanese fighters were slow to respond, having expected any attack from carriers much closer to the coast. The physical damage was minimal. Preliminary Japanese reports stated 12 killed and over 100 wounded. A handful of buildings were destroyed. But the psychological impact was enormous. The Japanese military had assured the public that the home islands were invulnerable. The emperor's capital was supposedly protected by an impenetrable defense ring. Now American bombers had appeared over Tokyo itself, dropping bombs on the imperial capital in broad daylight. The emperor's own palace had been exposed to danger. For the Japanese public, the raid shattered the illusion of invincibility. For the military, it was humiliation demanding response. The operation that would become the Battle of Midway was partly accelerated to prevent future raids by extending Japan's defensive perimeter. Yamamoto's letter to a colleague after the Doolittle raid captured his understanding. Britain and America might have underestimated Japan somewhat, but from their viewpoint, it was like having one's hand badly bitten by a dog they were feeding. America was determined to embark on full-scale operations against Japan. The mindless rejoicing at home over Pearl Harbor was deplorable. It made him fear the first blow at Tokyo would make the Japanese public wilt. Yamamoto understood what his fellow leaders didn't. The raid wasn't about the bombs. It was about American willpower. The Americans were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they reached Tokyo itself. 6 months, the prophecy fulfilled. Almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese combined fleet steamed toward Midway, the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled. Yamamoto's plan was complex and ambitious. A diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention northward. Meanwhile, the main striking force would approach Midway from the northwest. After carrier aircraft neutralized the island's defenses, an invasion force would land and capture the atoll. The real objective wasn't Midway itself, it was the American carriers. Yamamoto believed that when America learned of the threat to Midway, positioned strategically between Hawaii and Japan, the remaining carriers would sortie to defend it. The powerful Japanese fleet would be waiting to destroy them. Yamamoto brought 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had attacked the Pearl Harbor, crewed by Japan's most experienced pilots. He also deployed 2 light carriers, 11 battleships including the massive Yamato, and dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and support ships. Against this armada, Americans could muster only 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier. Navy yard workers at Pearl Harbor, told they had 3 months to repair the ship, did it in 72 hours of round-the-clock work. America had no battleships available. On paper, it should have been a Japanese victory. But American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to determine the target and timing. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team worked round the clock analyzing intercepted messages. They couldn't read everything, but they could read enough. A clever trick confirmed Midway was the target. Codebreakers suspected the Japanese designation AF referred to Midway, but needed proof. They arranged for the base at Midway to broadcast an uncoded message reporting their water purification system had broken down. Within 48 hours, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of water. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew Midway was the objective, knew approximately when the attack would come, and positioned his carriers to ambush the ambushers at a location optimistically codenamed Point Luck. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft struck Midway while American dive bombers hunted for the carriers. After hours of confusion and failed attacks, everything changed in 5 minutes. At 10:25 that morning, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with their decks full of aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Within minutes, all 3 carriers were burning. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was found and destroyed that afternoon. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and over 300 aircraft. More importantly, Japan lost hundreds of its most experienced pilots, men who'd spent years perfecting carrier operations and couldn't be quickly replaced. American losses were significant. The carrier Yorktown and a destroyer were sunk. Over 300 American sailors died. But the strategic outcome was clear. Yamamoto's prediction had come true. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's offensive capability was broken. The Imperial Navy would never again threaten Hawaii or the American mainland. From Midway forward, Japan would be fighting to defend what had already conquered, and America's industrial machine was just beginning to produce. The grinding match. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, the first major offensive operation of the Pacific War and the first test whether American ground forces could match Japanese soldiers in sustained combat. For the next 6 months, the fighting never stopped. The Japanese couldn't accept Guadalcanal's loss. The island sat astride supply routes between America and Australia. If America held it, Japanese positions throughout the South Pacific would be threatened. Imperial General Headquarters ordered the island retaken at any cost. Japanese forces attacked Henderson Field repeatedly by land, sea, and air. Marines and later Army soldiers fought off assault after assault. The names of battles, Alligator Creek, Edson's Ridge, the Matanaiku, Henderson Field, became Marine Corps legends. At sea, the fighting was equally savage.
7 major naval battles were fought in surrounding waters. So many ships were sunk that the waters between Guadalcanal and Florida Island became known as Iron Bottom Sound. The jungle warfare was hellish. Malaria struck down thousands on both sides. Tropical diseases, dysentery, and infections from minor wounds killed nearly as many as enemy action. The heat was oppressive, the terrain brutal, fresh water scarce, supply lines tenuous at best. Marines who expected a short campaign found themselves locked in a death struggle lasting month after month. They ate Japanese rations when their own ran out. They wore rotting uniforms and went weeks without adequate rest. They fought Japanese soldiers taught that surrender was worse than death, and who attacked with ferocity American troops had never faced. But when fighting ended in February 1943, Japan had suffered another defeat it couldn't afford. The Japanese lost over 14,000 killed in action, 9,000 to disease, and 1,000 captured. They lost 38 ships and over 600 aircraft. More critically, they lost the strategic initiative. Never again would Japanese forces attempt a major Pacific offensive. Perhaps as important as the military victory was the psychological one. On a level playing field, American ground forces had beaten Japan's best. The myth of Japanese invincibility on land, established in Malaya and the Philippines, was shattered. The arsenal unleashed. While Japan and America fought at Guadalcanal, American factories were performing production miracles that Japanese planners had believed impossible. When President Roosevelt called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, Hitler's advisors dismissed the numbers as propaganda. The entire American military had fewer than 3,000 aircraft in 1939. The idea of producing 50,000 planes annually seemed like fantasy. But American industry transformed itself with speed and scale that stunned the world.
Before the war, automobile manufacturers competed to produce cars and trucks for civilian consumers. After Pearl Harbor, they converted to war production almost overnight. The Ford Motor Company, which had built automobiles at a rate of 1 every 69 seconds, transformed operations entirely. The Willow Run plant in Michigan eventually produced B-24 Liberator bombers on assembly line principles never before applied to aircraft manufacturing. By war's end, Willow Run was producing bombers faster than any factory in the world, turning out 1 complete aircraft every 63 minutes. Shipyards expanded at similar rates. Gulf Shipbuilding in Alabama went from 240 employees at the start of 1940 to 11,600 by 1943. Alabama Dry Dock grew from 1,000 workers to nearly 30,000. Henry Kaiser shipyards pioneered construction techniques that reduced the time to build a Liberty ship from months to days. His workers could assemble a complete ship in under 2 weeks. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. By 1944, women made up over a third of the defense manufacturing workforce. They operated lathes and welding torches, assembled aircraft and ammunition, drove trucks and operated cranes. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of American determination. The results were staggering. By 1943, American shipyards were launching more tonnage in a single year than Japan had produced in the entire war to that point. American factories produced almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment, including 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million Army trucks. By 1944, more than half of all industrial production in the world was taking place in the United States. The disparity in carrier construction told the story most clearly. In the 3 years following Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers. America built 17. But even this understates the advantage. American carriers were larger, carried more aircraft, and were supported by vast fleets of supply ships, tankers, and repair vessels, allowing them to operate thousands of miles from home ports for months at a time. The numbers told the story Japanese leaders had refused to believe. They'd gambled that democracy would prevent America from mobilizing its resources. They'd assumed labor disputes, political divisions, and public demands for consumer goods would prevent full conversion to war production. They were catastrophically wrong. American civilians accepted rationing of gasoline, rubber, sugar, coffee, meat, and dozens of other goods. They bought war bonds by the billions. They worked overtime without complaint. They sent their sons and daughters to war. The democracy Japanese leaders dismissed as soft proved capable of sacrifices matching or exceeding those of any totalitarian state. The myth shattered. As American production soared and Japanese forces retreated across the Pacific, Japanese pilots began reporting something disturbing. Americans were fighting differently, not just with more ships and planes, but with greater skill and determination than Japanese doctrine had assumed possible. Japanese military training emphasized spiritual strength and warrior spirit as decisive combat factors. They believed American soldiers raised in soft democratic society would lack willingness to close with the enemy and fight to the death. Instead, they found Marines who charged machine gun positions, pilots who pressed attacks through walls of anti-aircraft fire, and sailors who fought burning ships until they sank beneath them. The Japanese had made a fundamental error.
They'd confused America's reluctance to enter the war with inability to fight it. The isolationism of the 1930s wasn't cowardice, it was a democratic nation debating whether distant conflicts were worth American blood. Once that debate was settled by Pearl Harbor, America fought with exactly the fury Yamamoto had predicted. The democracy that seemed divided and soft before December 7th became unified and ferocious after it. Japanese commanders discovered that American forces wouldn't negotiate local surrenders, wouldn't accept compromise peace terms, and wouldn't stop until they'd achieved total victory. The war Japan started with a surprise attack would end only with Japan's unconditional surrender. The Prophet's death. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, American P-38 fighters intercepted a transport aircraft over Bougainville Island. Aboard that aircraft was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, prophet who'd predicted Japan's defeat, and commander of the combined fleet. American codebreakers had intercepted and decoded his flight plans. A specially planned mission was launched to assassinate him. The P-38 shot down both bombers in Yamamoto's flight. The admiral's body was found the next day, still clutching his ceremonial sword. Yamamoto's death was a significant blow to Japanese morale. He was respected and admired throughout the Navy, one of the few leaders who commanded genuine loyalty rather than fearful obedience. His loss removed from Japanese councils the one voice that had consistently warned against underestimating America. But by April 1943, Yamamoto's warnings had already been proven correct. Japan was on the defensive across the Pacific. Its carrier force was crippled. Its best pilots were dead. The industrial tide Yamamoto had predicted was beginning to drown Japan's military. The man who understood America better than any Japanese leader, who tried to warn his nation against a war he knew it couldn't win, died knowing his worst predictions were coming true. The long road to Tokyo. Over the following 2 years, American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, each campaign bringing them closer to Japan. The strategy was deliberate. Rather than assault every Japanese-held island, American commanders identified key positions that could be captured and used as bases for further advances. Islands that couldn't support air bases or anchorages were bypassed, their Japanese garrisons left to wither without supplies or purpose. The Gilbert Islands fell in November 1943. Tarawa, a tiny atoll with a garrison of nearly 5,000 Japanese soldiers, cost the Marines over 1,000 killed and more than 2,000 wounded in just 76 hours of fighting. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated. Only 17 Japanese soldiers survived as prisoners. The Marshall Islands followed in early 1944. Kwajalein and Eniwato provided anchorages and airfields, bringing American forces within striking distance of the Mariana Islands. The Marianas Campaign in summer 1944 was the decisive strategic blow. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam put American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. For the first time since the Doolittle raid, Japan faced the prospect of sustained aerial bombardment. The battle for Saipan lasted 3 weeks. Over 3,000 Americans were killed and more than 10,000 wounded. The Japanese lost nearly 30,000 soldiers, most dying rather than surrendering. Hundreds of Japanese civilians, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture and murder them, committed suicide by jumping off cliffs at the island's northern end. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Marines fought for 36 days to capture an island of 8 square miles. The Japanese had fortified the volcanic rock with tunnels, bunkers, and interconnected detective positions, making every yard of advance a battle. Nearly 7,000 Americans died on Iwo Jima, another 19,000 were wounded. The Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 soldiers was virtually annihilated. Only about 200 were captured as prisoners of war. At Okinawa, fighting lasted almost 3 months and cost over 12,000 American lives. The Japanese deployed kamikaze aircraft in mass attacks for the first time, sinking or damaging dozens of American ships. The civilian population suffered terribly, caught between American bombardment and Japanese soldiers who sometimes used them as shields or forced them to commit suicide.
These casualties were precisely what Japanese strategy had counted on. The militarists believed that if they made victory expensive enough, Americans would demand peace rather than continue the slaughter. Instead, each bloody victory only strengthened American resolve to finish the job. The sacrifices at Iwo Jima and Okinawa were justified by the promise they were bringing final victory closer. Polls showed American public support for the war remained overwhelming, even as casualty lists grew longer. The home islands burn. By summer 1945, American B-29 bombers were reducing Japanese cities to ashes. The firebombing of Tokyo in March killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night. The home islands that Japanese leaders had promised were invulnerable were burning. And still Japan fought on. The atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally brought Japan's surrender. But the outcome had been determined years earlier in the fundamental miscalculation that led Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. Japanese leaders had believed Americans were soft, that democracy made nations weak, and that industrial potential meant nothing without spiritual will to use it.
They'd believed a surprise attack would break American morale rather than unite it. They were wrong about everything. The reckoning. The war Japan started on December 7, 1941, ended on September 2, 1945, when Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The ceremony took place on the deck of a ship named for an American state, under guns representing American industrial power, in the harbor of a Japanese capital that had been reduced to ashes. The symmetry was deliberate and devastating. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the surrender. Representatives of all Allied powers stood behind him. The Japanese delegation in formal morning coats and top hats looked stiff and uncomfortable as they signed documents ending Japanese imperial ambitions forever. Among the flags displayed on Missouri was the same flag that had flown over the Capitol building in Washington on December 7, 1941. Another flag present was the 31-star flag that Commodore Matthew Perry had carried when he opened Japan to Western trade in 1853. The message was clear. Japan's attempt to build an empire had ended where it began, with American ships in Tokyo Bay. Standing nearby in spirit was the Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor, where 1,177 American sailors remain entombed in the ship that carried them to their deaths on that Sunday morning when Japan's Great Miscalculation began. Those men died because Japanese leaders convinced themselves their attack would break American will. Instead, it forged that will into something unbreakable. The cost. The cost of the miscalculation was staggering. Japan lost over 2 million military personnel killed in the war. Civilian deaths from bombing, starvation, and the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the total to nearly 3 million. 66 Japanese cities were destroyed by American bombing. The once proud Japanese Navy was annihilated. The empire that had stretched across Asia and the Pacific was reduced to the 4 home islands. America paid its own price. Over 400,000 Americans died in World War II, including over 100,000 in the Pacific Theater. Millions more were wounded physically and psychologically. The war cost the United States over $300 billion, a sum exceeding $4 trillion in modern currency. But America emerged from the war as the most powerful nation on Earth, with industrial capacity that dwarfed all competitors and a military that could project force anywhere on the globe. The country Japan had dismissed as soft and decadent had proven itself capable of winning the greatest war in human history. The lesson. The story of Japan's misjudgment is not simply about one war. It's a warning about the dangers of underestimating adversaries, of believing other peoples are fundamentally different or inferior, of assuming what looks like weakness is actually weakness. Admiral Yamamoto saw past these illusions because he'd taken time to know America, not as a target to be attacked, but as a nation of human beings with their own strengths and values. His warnings went unheeded because they contradicted what Japanese leaders wanted to believe. The consequences of that self-deception were measured in millions of lives, Japanese and American alike. 16 million Americans served in uniform during World War II. American factories outproduced all other combatants combined. A nation Japanese planners had dismissed as too divided and too comfortable to fight, sustained the bloodiest conflict in human history.